Good morning, and thank you for this introduction and for coming to my paper on film consumption during the Second World War in the Midlands, which is part of my wider exploration into the regional cinema-going experiences. This was a time when going to the pictures was Britain's predominant leisure activity, and attendances reached an unprecedented 31 million a week by the end of the war. For those of you who are unfamiliar where the Midlands is, it's in the centre of the UK, and my research in film consumption is concentrated on two of its counties, Worcestershire and Staffordshire, with particular emphasis on Worcester City, the county of Stafford, and Craigleheath in the Black Country. There was, however, not just one audience that went to the pictures. Audiences consisted of multiple individuals with many different patterns of taste and behaviour regarding their age, social class, gender, as well as their different geographical regions. So my research uses a multi-source archival approach, such as mass observation reports, newspapers, although it draws largely upon the box office returns, which are the ledgers that recorded the weekly gross take-ins. This will address how these regional communities responded to this form of mass-produced, commercialised entertainment regarding viewing trends and film genre preferences within three chronological periods of the war: its beginning, its middle, and its end. And if they differ to what's perceived to be Britain's flagship cinema, the Empire Leicester Square, and films polls from the British Films Institute, the BFI, and Cinema's trade weekly paper. So box office ledgers are pretty rare, as most were destroyed, but luckily some have been preserved. And these were from three cinemas in Stafford: the Picture House, the Sandonia and the Albert Hall, the Scala at Worcester, and the Royal in Craigleheath in the Black Country. All the cinemas were independently owned by families or local entrepreneurs, and many spreadsheets were made for each film exhibited in each cinema, including their origin, their film genre, their production and distribution companies, as well as their take-ins. So from the beginning in 1896, moving pictures were initially shown as novelty acts in music halls and travelling shows. And by the First World War, the cinema had overtaken the music hall as the most popular form of commercialised entertainment, with about 4,500 cinemas by World War II, with many cinemas in the towns. The popularity of cinema going was not too difficult to explain, as it was cheap and therefore an affordable luxury for the predominantly working class audience, who now spent an increasing proportion of their income on leisure, especially cinema going, as confirmed by multiple surveys, such as the Wartime Survey of 1943. Cinema going soon became established, as A.J.P. Taylor suggests, the essential social habit of the age, with queues a common sight in Britain's streets. But when war was declared on September the 3rd, 1939, the government immediately closed cinemas to avoid potential casualties from bombing, resulting in playwright George Bernard Shaw stating it was a piece of unimaginative stupidity. However, they soon reopened once the government acknowledged that going to the pictures could be used for morale-boosting programmes and propaganda, and an excellent medium for entertaining the troops and the nation. Cinemas in this time offered a continuous performance programme consisting of adverts, newsreels, cartoons, the main feature film, and occasionally a second film of lesser quality, the B film, and you could stay as long as you want and go in and out. Many smaller cinemas also had midweek changes, which offered a completely different programme, so there's lots to see and do. Cinemas were social places where people could meet their friends and socialise and gain information from pathy newsreels, fantasise over film stars to escape the hardship of relentless war work, take comfort both emotionally and physically, and be entertained via feature films in a warm and often luxurious environment. Women, who made up the greater part of the audience, could find solace in the cinema in the face of wartime anxieties over their rationing, their children's evacuation, long working hours, bombing and war's general drabness. There was, as David Morley suggests, more to cinema going than merely seeing a film. It was a socialised experience, from everybody queuing together in the entrance foyer, the anticipation of the fading house light, the curtain opening on the screen, and the presentation of the feature film. So while the arrival of the cinema hoped to dissipate any segregation between the classes, as both middle and working classes combined to make cinema going a mass leisure activity, there were still discrepancies between the classes reflecting their inequalities. Cinemas exhibited spatial segregation regarding a tiered system of seating prices, with the more expensive and consequently the better viewing experiences in the higher balconies rather than the lower stalls. Admissions ranged from a few pence upwards, although entrance could often be made by exchanging empty jam jars for the war effort. And attending particular cinemas also helped preserve any distinctions between the social classes. If you look here, some cinemas like the Picture House and the Scala were purpose-built cinemas and tended to show up-to-date films from the major Hollywood studios like MGM. They were a bit plusher and constructed with cafes and tea rooms and luxurious decorations to give an air of respectability in order to attract a middle-class clientele. Many, like the Mock Tudor Picture House, were considered an ideal place for courtship, where you could impress your partner, or even for groups of women who could feel safe and secure, especially with the high quality and often romantic films, as well as providing aspiration for the lower classes. The less salubrious Sandonia and the Albert Hall, often known as the flea pits, from when films tended to be shown in these old halls, or like the Roll, which is the repurposed skating rink, tended to show much older, cheaply made and inferior films. These were often American B films of poor quality from the smaller studios like Republic, and usually were adventures, dramas and mysteries such as Charlie Chan, or gangster films like The Dead End Kids. For example, Cradley Heath Royal Cinema showed 4 Charlie Chan films in 1940, while the much nicer Picture House didn't show any. So the early period of the war produced several propaganda films, such as The Lion Has Wings, which was quickly and poorly made, although it convinced the government of the value of film to raise morale, disseminate information, and to prepare the nation for war. Other early wartime films reflected a fear of invasion and espionage, which resulted in several spy films and thrillers, such as Confessions of a Nazi Spy, although Stafford's Picture House audiences preferred Arthur Askey's comedies, Charlie's Big-Hearted Aunt. The 49th parallel was made to encourage American involvement in the war, and the parallel was the division between Canada, part of the British Commonwealth, and also engaged in the war at the beginning, and the United States, who weren't in the war yet. It was the BFI's top grossing film in 41, but it wasn't released in Stafford nor Worcester until 42, by which time Americans were already in the war. 1939's film Shipyard Sally was Northern comedian Gracie Field's wartime tribute to the ship workers. Hence, in 1939, it topped the rankings in industrialised towns like Stafford and the chain-making town of Cradley Heath, as well as being popular in the southern town of Portsmouth, Britain's naval base. Yet it wasn't even shown in the Empire London. And according to the BFI, the most popular film in 1939 was Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, while middle-class audiences at the Scala in Worcester preferred Shaw's Pygmalion film. So during the middle part of the war, in 42 to 43, the commonality of people's wartime experiences, such as the awareness of bombing, hardship, loss, made filmmakers increasingly aware of the needs of the audience. Films are now becoming realistic, such as the documentary style In Which We Serve, made with the assistance of the Ministry of Information. While it functions to sustain morale, it emphasised the dedication to duty and to the sacrifices Britain had made in these challenging times, and it presented an optimistic vision of the future. It was Britain's most popular film with the BFI and the film trade magazines in 43, especially in Worcester and Portsmouth, yet Stafford House's, their Picture House audience, yet again preferred Arthur Askey in King Arthur Was a Gentleman. However, the 2 films that monopolised British screens this period were American, Mrs. Miniver and Random Harvest, both starring Greer Garson. They offered a romantic and stylised Hollywood version of wartime Britain in the darker days of war, and reflected how the war was influencing personal experiences and relationships. And such poignant films about loss and desire struck a chord with the audiences. Films towards the end of the war, 44 to 45, when it appeared the Allies were winning after D-Day, now changed their approach from jingoistic wartime films to emphasising the experience of individuals and war's impact on home, family life and emotions. This happy breed, made in expensive Technicolor to indicate the film's importance, now depicted realistic themes of families coping with the effect of war, And although set in the interwar period, it doesn't romanticise loss and hardship despite the looming anxieties of the forthcoming Second World War. It was the most successful British film of 1944 all over. And with 90% of women now mobilised and employed for the war effort following conscription in 1941, women made up the larger part of the audience, as going to the pictures was a perfect way to unwind after long, hard working days. And companies like Gainsborough Pictures quickly capitalised upon making films for this niche audience to reflect their increasing contribution to the war effort. Films like Millions Like Us depicted the austere realism of women of various social classes now employed as conscripted munition workers and made to represent the nation pulling together for the war effort. The filmmakers explicitly represented their experience of living under the continual threat of bombing, tragedy and death, while retaining their pluckiness and sense of humour. However, contemporary comments reflected that, well, as they were at work all day, they didn't really want to see factory life on the screen and was only the 14th best film at Stafford. But what they really wanted to see was escapist romances and costumed historical films. And Gainsborough exploited this new female audience by moving away from making B films and Will Hay comedies into making escapist period melodramas like The Man in Grey and Fanny by Gaslight, where actresses like Patricia Rock, Margaret Lockwood and Phyllis Calvert were now the chief protagonists. Some such women were presented as powerful images of female independence and rebellion, much like the newly and unprecedentedly independent and mobilised women. This female audience could indulge their romantic fantasies over the torrid, passionate love scenes depicted on the screen, with British heartthrobs Stuart Granger and James Mason, perhaps as compensation for their absent loved ones. Unsurprisingly, these films were the most popular British films in this period, and Stafford and Worcester were no exception. Examining the box office returns at a local level has often challenged some of the preconceived ideas of popularity and listings by organisations like the BFI. It's often mythologised that the film everybody was seeing during the Second World War was Gone with the Wind, an American Civil War romantic melodrama, and was, according to the BFI, the highest rated film of 1940. However, while it was continuously shown at the Ritz, London, for 201 weeks, virtually the whole of the war, it was only released at Worcester for 1 week in 1942 and not shown in Stafford at all till 1948. Others, for example, The Wizard of Oz, Casablanca and Citizen Kane, considered today to be critically acclaimed classics, didn't rank highly at all, suggesting there were some anomalies between what people enjoyed on the ground level to what middle-class critics preferred. And as probably expected, comedy films persisted throughout the war and were, I suggest, light-hearted relief and a diversion from the uncertainties of wartime, with popular tropes of our hero triumphing over a threatening force, like the Nazis. Many of these films were showcases for popular working-class comedians from the now declining music hall industry. George Formby was Britain's most popular comedian, with 12 films made during the war. He epitomised a symbol of the people, and his films appealed to the largely working-class audiences, accompanied by his trademark ukulele, and many were in the top 3 in Stafford and Worcester. His comical and slightly saucy songs helped take Britain's mind off the war, and Let George Do It was the only one of his films to appear at the London's Empire. Similarly, The 9 Wartime Adventures of Old Mother Riley, starring Arthur Lucan as an Irish washerwoman with his wife Kitty McShane playing his daughter, were cheaply made but profitable and extremely popular. Surprisingly, Arthur Lucan was voted the 6th biggest box office star by the Motion Picture Herald in 1943, and that was behind Betty Grable and Bob Hope. These films were usually played in Stafford's smaller and cheaper venues like the Albert Hall and the Sandonian, and not at all in London's more salubrious Empire or even Stafford's Picture House. However, long-forgotten Lancashire comedian Frank Randall's series of army camp films, Somewhere in Camp and Somewhere on Leave, were more popular the further north the film was exhibited. They were very popular in Stafford, but not exhibited at all in Worcester. His brand of bawdy masculine humour didn't travel south very well. Similarly, London comedian Tommy Trinder's films, based on, The Foreman Goes to France, was not preferred at all in the Midlands either. Examining comedy genres has shown that the film popularity was indicative of working class audiences, Crayley Heath and Stafford, probably identifying with the familiarity of these regional comics, and they probably had seen them at the music halls as well. The presence of American GIs at Cannock Chase in Stafford was also a factor to be considered regarding local film consumption, with Yankee Doodle Dandy and This Is the Army, all American flag-waving films, among the top grossing films here. And now with 75% of films distributed in Britain being American and increasingly in colour, audiences now began to prefer seeing films which epitomise Hollywood glamour after the drabness of war. So in conclusion, cinema going was an affordable luxury and provides an escape from wartime anxieties, especially for mobilised women. The war changed not over people's everyday lives at home, but also their cinema going experiences. And as it progressed, the film studios began to produce films that reflected the changing wartime environment and evolving tastes. American films becoming increasingly preferred to British audiences as audience strive for a bit of Hollywood glamour and heralded a growing trend of Americanization. The analysis of the rare box office returns can therefore argue that there's a localized and regionalized flavour to film consumption, which is dependent on the cultural geographies, not only to the reception of particular film genres, but also upon the physical spaces where the film was exhibited. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Linda. I hope you can hear me now. Is that
yes? Yeah.
Excellent, good. I've managed to exercise my internet gremlins. Thank you for starting off for us so valiantly. These technical issues are just the plague of sometimes. Thank you very much. So we're going to go straight to the next paper, and after we've had all three papers, we'll have some time for questions. So up next, we've got Talita Magnolo, who's going to talk about Brazilian press and North American press. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I have a PowerPoint to share with you. Let me know if everything is okay. Okay?
Yep, that's great.
Yeah.
I have prepared a text to read for you so you can understand me better. My name is Talita. I'm from Brazil, and currently I am a PhD student, and my study involves the specialized magazines in television in the 50s and 60s here in Brazil. What I'm going to present to you today is a research project that recently be approved to be studied and to be real in the United States during a visiting scholar program. So I'm very happy and I hope you enjoy it. My academic research started with the Brazilian magazine Intervalo, published by Abril editors between 63 and 72 during my master's degree. Intervalo is considered one of the most important specialized publications that emerged between the 60s and 70s here in Brazil, as its value in its entirety in television subjects. The inspiration for the launch of Intervalo came from the United States, from one of the most famous magazines of the time, TV Guide, a small format publication which contained all television programs covering the North American continent from coast to coast and all TV stations. This way of communicating TV programming and let the viewer know so that they could follow their favorite shows, movies, and series was bold and innovative for that time, especially for the United States, which saw TV appear before Brazil and was experiencing a context of social, political, and cultural effervescence. More than offering TV programming, TV Guide and Intervalo came up with the intention of treating the issues that were on the television in a journalistic way. Thus, the magazines built a very close relationship with TV and changed their way of communicating, as television has also evolved since the creation of new programs and new communication strategies. The documentation of the magazine's history is linked to the importance of the memory of the history of American media, but also the history of Brazilian media. that since the arrival of television has used the North American medium as great inspiration, not only physically, as happened with the magazine TV Guide and Intervalo, but also the dissemination of new mass culture, behavior, TV programs, artists, singers, and ways of producing media content. Despite the 10-year gap between the publication of TV Guide and Intervalo, both American and Brazilian magazines have become important reference in the way of talking about television, especially when they brought television programming to their pages. The comparison that follows has a main objective to illustrate the study that I intend to do during a split-site PhD program in the United States at Brown University. Editoras Abril Weekly was inspired by the production of the Triangle publications. However, there has been no research to date on the extent of this relationship and which aspects were actually used in the magazine Intervalo, which was the main goals of this international research. The cover. Starting with the cover, we can see some similarities, such as the magazine logo. Both highlight the letter T and V and use the color red to attract the reader's attention. The names are found in a box which resembles a television screen from that period and are in the upper left corner. In this specific example, they print similar photographs, the American actress Sally Field and the Brazilian singer Vanderleia, part of a Jovem Guarda group. The editorial. Another similarity that we can notice between the two publications is in the magazine's editorial. The first aspect, which is easily noticeable, is the layout in two columns. The left column contains information about the magazine's edition. Therefore, we were able to locate the number and the date of the edition, the team that worked on the magazine, information on the distribution and its circulation, as we can see in the image below. Yellow pages. Right in the first issue, Intervalo brought a lot of information about what Editora Abril's new publication would be like. Among its fixed sections appeared O que aconteceu, or What happened, which was intended to release small notes about the latest events in the world of television. The page was yellow and a small size photo accompanied each note. In the TV Guide magazine, we were able to find some similarity with the page, also yellow, of special articles. What we can see is that, again, the layout is very similar, including the font that is used in as we can see in the image below. The TV programming. As already mentioned, the biggest feature of the both magazines was the dissemination of television programming. As we can see, the layout was practically identical. It contained the number of channels in small squares, which also resemble the screen of a television, the show time, and the name of the program in capital letters and in bold, followed by a brief explanation. Activities. In addition to articles, profiles, and television programming, the magazines also brought interactive activities with their readers, such as crossword puzzles, whose theme was about the world of television, and most of the answers were in their pages. In addition to generating an approximation with their reader, the magazines were able to create a loyalty process, since the answers would only be released in the following edition. Articles. Despite not having many articles, the magazine TV Guide during the 60s brought some reports that came in color pages with photographs and a different layout. The same pattern was repeated in Brazil with Intervalo magazine. The biggest difference is in the amount of material to the difference of the size of television programming. in United States, there were already several TV stations, and the signal had already arrived in many places on the continent. And in contrast, here in Brazil, TV was developing and arriving slowly. Advertising. Finally, one last detail that catches the eye is the advertising on the last page of the magazine. Although not the same product, the layout follows the same standards as we can see in the image below. Thank you very much.
That's great. Thank you so much, Talita. That's really interesting. I'm just going to move straight into our final speaker, and I'm not sure who heard me or didn't hear me at the beginning, so I'll just sort of recap as well. We're going to have some questions at the end, and if there are any questions that you think of, you can always put them in the chat, and then I can read them out after we've had all the papers, or you can stick your hand up and we can have some interactive Q&A. So without further ado, I'm going to hand you over to Lena.
Okay, hello people. I hope you can hear me and see the screen at least.
Yes,
properly.
Everything's perfect.
Cool. Okay. One thing I say always before I start is that I speak fast and I have a Greek accent, so bear this in mind. Hopefully, it will be not be too fast. And I will move us a few centuries back because this is very much an early modern paper. That is through news and the readers, credibility and news reporting in early modern England, and it's part of a chapter I'm writing on earthquake reportage, actually. So, on 24 May 1688, Londoners who bought the London Gazette learned that on the 20th of October last, at 4 o'clock in the morning, there happened an earthquake at Lima, in the Kingdom of Peru, in the other side of the world, pretty much. Despite the chronological distance from this event that shook a faraway land, readers in London were able to learn more about seismic activity happening in the other side of the world. Even though many learned commentators criticized the thirst for news, events taking place in distant lands were of prime interest to readers, judging by how often they were presented in newspapers and other news media. This was the case with news about earthquakes as well. Even though there has always been interest in earthquakes, in the 17th century, the rise of serial publications, accompanied by increased international trade and colonization, made news of earthquakes more easily accessible and more significant, even when such news took a long way to reach Europe. This paper will engage primarily with the ways in which English newspapers reported earthquakes, and the ways in which they tried, successfully or not, to bolster the claims of credibility. The aim of this paper is to engage with Barbara Shapiro's analysis of 17th century newspapers as discourses of fact, and to show the ways in which we can expand on this, but also problematize its applicability when examining news. Barbara Shapiro has analyzed newspapers as discourses of fact, stating that they attempt to strengthen their credibility by emphasizing that their sources were reliable. They used credible witnesses who had first-hand experience of the events, but also by employing a style of writing that could be construed as more objective. Newspapers trumpeted claims of truth-telling and impartiality in their titles and contents, and editors supported such claims by specifying the time and place of an event, by employing tentative language when they thought they didn't have enough information, and by rejecting hearsay. In Shapiro's words, newspapers stressed the rejection of fiction and the distinction between a relation of matters of fact and commentary or conjecture on those facts. Newspaper reportage of earthquakes can be an illuminating example of Shapiro's analysis, as natural history was also a field on which discourses of fact were increasingly dominant. According to Vladimir Yankovic, the new sciences from the mid-17th century were marked by the socially informed practices of epistemological censoring. Through these practices, the new sciences declare illicit the discourses which failed to dissociate nature from politics, psychology from objectivity. In other words, which failed to make nature the subject of disinterested fact-gathering and specified literary technologies of reporting. Both scholars show that newspapers and natural sciences emphasized matter of fact and disinterested observation as the main methods for information gathering and presenting. In the reportage of natural phenomena, such as earthquakes, these methods of presenting information intersected. So this paper will show that even though newspaper reportage often claimed to be matter of fact, credible, and disinterested, these claims were undermined by the use of anonymous witnesses whose credibility could not be checked, by adopting what Daniel Wolf called the common voice, and by choosing which eyewitness accounts to accept or not. So, talk first about witnesses and credibility. Barbara Shapiro has argued that newspapers try to strengthen their claims of truth-telling and fidelity by using credible witnesses. However, this was often more of a promise than a reality. It was not easy to find credible witnesses, so any kind of eyewitness account was desirable. In the case of earthquakes, newspapers often imply that the information comes from eyewitnesses. For example, when reporting on an earthquake happening in Naples in June 1688, the London Gazette included a first-person description. The 7th instant, we had here another earthquake. The 10th, we again perceived the trembling of the earth, and on the 14th, felt a more violent shock, which threw down several houses, so that we fear the earthquake will continue all this moon. Even though the account is coming, readers are left to assume, from an eyewitness, no attempt is made to ascertain the status and their credibility. More commonly, however, newspapers do not specifically mention where the information comes from, or they show that it's a second-hand account, a report, or a ship passing from a stricken area. For example, news about an earthquake in Smyrna, in the Ottoman Empire's coast, in 1680, arrived at London by letters from Smyrna, which had gone through Amsterdam. In the same year, the London Gazette brought news of an earthquake in Malaga, which came from the ship Sarah of Hamburg that had stopped there after the earthquake. This report did not specify how the earthquake took place or the damage caused, and did not include any eyewitness accounts. At least this report included the name of the ship, because in 1681, the True Protestant Mercury was even more vague, saying that here is advised by a ship from Candia of a great earthquake lately happening there. All of these accounts come from correspondence. Implicit in the use of correspondence for news gathering was the assumption that correspondents were credible. Traditionally, such correspondents were diplomats or other officials. Their account could be seen as credible, even if they often reported rumors or the mood of a city rather than verified events. Newspapers, however, kept the appearance of correspondence without specifying who their sources were. Readers had to take this on trust. In this, they were imitating newsletters, manuscript news, which were sent to subscribers. Newsletter readers relied on the credibility of the newsletter writer rather than the sources themselves. For example, readers could assume that Henry Madman, one of the most famous newsletter writers of the period, would have credible information. Similarly, newspapers could reinforce their credibility when their editor was known, such as Doc's newsletter or John Danton's The Athenian Mercury, or when the newspaper was connected to official sources, such as the London Gazette. Even in these cases, however, trustworthiness lay in the editors or newspapers themselves rather than the witnesses. As we have seen in the case of earthquake reportage, no credible witnesses were employed. Newspapers relied on the status of their editor to be seen as trustworthy and claimed implicitly that their sources were credible because they were used by them. This, however, was a significant leap of faith, given that there was no way to ascertain where this news came from. Rather than presenting specific witnesses, newspapers often resorted to what has been described as a common voice or common fame. According to Daniel Wolf, this was a consensual view of events, which was agreed upon by local inhabitants. Wolf uses this concept to talk about the memory of a community and argues that this common voice was accepted as credible by antiquarians and historians in early modern England. Information gained by the consensus of inhabitants could be suspect or distorted, but in the absence of other sources, it could be taken as an authoritative source of information. And Vladimir Yankovic has employed Wolf's concept of the common voice to discuss how pamphleteers writing about prodigies and miracles used local inhabitants almost exclusively as witnesses. The same emphasis on the common voice can be seen in newspaper reportage of earthquakes. For example, in 1652, the several proceedings in Parliament reported that from the island of Keele, on the 25th instant, about 10 at night, the people of these islands were terrified with an earthquake, that they feared the falling down of their low houses, the wind being very calm at the time. Here, the phrasing of the news report suggests that we hear the experiences of local inhabitants. The same can be said about an earthquake in Lyon in 1682. Sorry, lost it. The right of the 30th instant that an earthquake has lately happened in those parts, continuing very terrible for the space of half an hour, to the great consternation of the inhabitants. Another account in the London Gazette, on the right side of this slide, starts by providing information in the third person, but then moves to the first, suggesting that this was also taken from local eyewitnesses. And it says, on Saturday last, the 15th and about the 22nd hour, happened here a dreadful earthquake, though it lasted not long, which frightening the inhabitants out of their houses with the terror of an inevitable destruction, they betook themselves to the piazzas and the open public spaces of the city. And the same report continues, this day we have felt nothing of it. This is framed again as an eyewitness account. With no way of knowing the identity of this source, its credibility rests on assuming it represents what local inhabitants experience. So far, we have seen that newspapers often had to rely on oral reports of dubious provenance and accept them as reliable. Nonetheless, they could also reject particular reports as hearsay when they did not fit with their worldview. This is evident in the case of prodigies, which includes any event that was considered inexplicable or to have a supernatural explanation, such as monsters or monstrous births. Earthquakes could also be discarded as prodigious and analyzed as an expression of God's wrath. Due to the brevity of newspaper reports, they did not often present providential accounts. When they engaged with such questions, newspapers showed an ambivalent stance towards prodigies, which reflects some of the criticism of 17th century thinkers. For example, the domestic intelligence in 1679 mentioned, there is a relation from Scotland of which we must expect a confirmation, that on Thursday, the 10th day of this instant, July, there happened a terrible storm of thunder and lightning, accompanied with an earthquake, which shook the house in a dreadful manner, after which it is said that there were appearances of several shapes and figures in the sky, it means, and several persons that were in the fields do affirm that before the beginning of the tempest, they heard a terrible noise, like the bellowing of a bull. And this is a very common way of talking about supernatural events, really, seeing figures in the sky. Here, the newspaper employs qualifying language when talking about the experiences of eyewitnesses. We expect confirmation. It is said several persons do affirm. This report opts for non-committal language, neither accepting nor rejecting such claims of eyewitnesses. The same newspaper was even more cautious in 1681 when talking about the experience of, when presenting news of an earthquake in Lyon. And this is the same earthquake I was talking about before, actually. And it says, several people affirm that they saw flames of fire ascending out of the earth, but it is imagined they might be deceived by the flashes of lightning that ran along the ground. Here we see a clearer example of the rejection of prodigies as hearsay. Again, the same eyewitnesses who have been credible enough when it came to description of the earthquake are seen as deceived when they claim to have seen something providential. The editor foregrounds its skepticism and provides an explanation rooted in natural history. The true Protestant Mercury of 1681 is even more direct when he mentions that there is likewise a noise of an earthquake near Exbridge, but we are sparing to credit visions and prodigies. Here, however, we may assume that this could also have political reasons behind this rejection of prodigies. In the same paragraph, the newspaper mentions that the maid of Hatfield, who was a female prophetess, had tried to see the king, claiming that an apparition had advised her to tell the king that he should not move Parliament to Oxford. And the editor here noted that most concluded the transport of a melancholy imagination. In this context, we can assume that the noise of an earthquake was also riddled with apocryphal meaning against moving Parliament. And this could suggest that the editor is making a political rather than a scientific point, if you wish. Nonetheless, newspapers did not always show skepticism towards prodigies, but sometimes presenting earthquakes with language that harked back to providence. For example, describing earthquakes as prodigious, as they often do, or focusing on the miraculous salvation of individuals, was a way to tacitly acknowledge that these natural catastrophes had a divine origin and that God could influence their outcome. Modern history, or a monthly account of all considerable occurrences, a serial publication which appeared monthly and thus existed in a space between a newspaper and a pamphlet, mentioned that in the Naples earthquake in 1688, several ladies that were there were miraculously taken out alive from under the ruins. Interestingly, the Athenian Gazette, a newspaper which was aimed at answering questions of its readers in literary, religious, scientific, or historical matters, also ventured into this field. On the issue of 11 October 1693, a reader asked John Danton, the editor, his opinion about the recently published book, A Practical Discourse on the Late Earthquakes, with an historical account of prodigies and their various effects, whose author is identified as a Reverend Divine. Danton answered favorably, claiming that in this book, there is the most elaborate discourse of prodigies and the best observations on the late earthquakes we have yet seen. Here, Danton sees no tension between prodigies and observations. Andrew Pettigrew argues that the Athenian Gazette was very different from the science of the philosophical transactions, but on the other hand, it was also a far cry from the newsbooks and their monthly births. Here, however, this is not the case, since Danton gives his stamp of approval to a discourse on prodigies and the religious meaning of earthquakes. To conclude, newspapers attempted to present the reportage of earthquakes as a discourse of fact, making claims of fidelity and reporting matter of fact. Shapiro's claim that they did so by using credible witnesses and employing an objective tone is more difficult to support. As we have seen, newspaper editors used any witness accounts they could get their hands on, and more often than not, did not specify where the information came from. They implied that they had eyewitness accounts by presenting the perspective or using the first-person descriptions of earthquakes. Even though they used oral testimonies, they were ready to gloss over any reports that did not agree with their own worldview. This should not make us think that this is a fact versus interpretation battle, however. Not only were editors happy to provide their own interpretations of events, but they could also include, or at least accept sometimes, providential discourses. It seems that whether a description of an earthquake would be dismissed as hearsay or accepted as the common voice, depending on its editor and on the particular circumstances surrounding the seismic event. If we see newspaper reports as discourses of fact, I think we should stress the discourse part far more than the fact. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. As a 20th century historian, it's always nice to have a little trip into the early modern world. I find it all very exciting. I just want to thank our panelists for 3 very, very interesting papers. It's been an absolute pleasure to listen to your research. And thank you all for coming. Thank you.
Thank you, Edda.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you very much, everyone.